Alright guys, Dominic here for KitGuru, and if you're in the market for a brand new monitor, it can often be a real challenge to know exactly what it is you should buy. There's so much jargon and technical terms being thrown around left, right and centre, as well as an absolute ton of monitors to choose from. Well, we thought it was time to simplify matters and make things easier for you. That's why we've teamed up with MSI for this sponsored buyer's guide video, where we're going to go through and break down everything you need to know before buying your next gaming monitor. Starting right at the beginning then, the first two things I would think about are how big do I want the screen to be and what resolution am I after. Screen size is exactly that, how large the display is going to be, which is measured on the diagonal, while resolution is the number of pixels which will be found in your monitor. Resolution and screen size are very much linked, however, as there's no point getting a 45-inch monitor if it's only got a 1080p resolution, as it will be rather blurry, while equally you're not going to get the benefits of a 4K resolution if the screen is only 20 inches. 27-inch is considered a good sweet spot for many gamers these days, with both the MSI Mag 274 UPF and MSI Mag 275 CQRXF offering that screen size, with the former being a 4K resolution while the latter is 1440p. Many people out there, however, may want to consider an even larger screen depending on your personal preference, and maybe one that will give you more screen real estate, like an ultra-wide. That brings us nicely onto aspect ratio then, which simply describes the overall shape of the monitor, so how square or how rectangular it is. A 16:9 aspect ratio, for instance, is still the most common these days, which is typically referred to as a standard widescreen, but the 21:9 aspect ratio is getting increasingly popular as it does give you that extra horizontal field of view. To demonstrate that, here we have MSI's 342C QD OLED ultrawide. You're also going to want to consider whether you want a curved or a flat panel. Now, this is entirely personal preference, though generally curved panels can offer increased immersion, which we get with the 275C QRXF and MSI's 342C OLED, though if you do any specific work where straight lines are crucial, then you may need a flat panel, as demonstrated by the 274 UPF. All three of these monitors use different panel types too. We're talking things like IPS, VA, TN and OLED. Now this is where things can get a little bit more complex, as IPS, VA and TN are all forms of LCD panels which use a backlight. OLED is a bit different, however, as it doesn't have a backlight. Instead, each individual pixel is its own light source. We're not going to get super technical here in this video, but the main thing to know is each of those different panel types have their own characteristics and their own pros and cons, which we are going to delve into a bit deeper later on in this video. Of the three MSI monitors that we do have here today, the 274 UPF is an IPS panel, the 275 CQRXF is a VA panel, and the 342C is an OLED display. Now we're moving on to talk about some more gamer-specific areas of a monitor, starting off with the refresh rate. In simple terms, this describes how many times per second a monitor is able to refresh the contents being shown on screen. This is measured in hertz, and the higher the refresh rate, the smoother and snappier the monitor will both look and feel. 60 Hz, for instance, was the standard for a long time, but in the gaming monitor space, 120 or 144 Hz is now considered relatively baseline, and some monitors like the 275 CQRXF are even able to hit 240 Hz, while others can go higher still. It is worth pointing out, however, that to get the most from a high refresh rate, you do need a PC that is able to output the required frame rate. There's little point having a 240Hz gaming monitor, for instance, if your PC can only hit 60 FPS. Resolution plays a factor here too, as higher resolutions like 4K are much harder to drive than a 1080p or 1440p resolution. For example, to drive the 4K 144Hz 274 UPF at its maximum refresh rate, you will likely want a high-end GPU, perhaps one of MSI's 40 series cards, where something like DLSS 3 can also offer a benefit in hitting those higher frame rates. Higher refresh rates typically result in lower motion blur too, as the higher the refresh, the more frequently the display is updated per second. Now, this is linked to, but isn't quite the same thing as a monitor's response time. Measured in milliseconds, response time simply tells us how quickly a display is able to transition from one colour to another, with faster times being better. That's because a monitor with fast response times will show little to no ghosting or trailing of the image, whereas you will get a lot of ghosting and smearing on a monitor with slow response times, which of course isn't great for gaming. Response times is one particular area where OLED monitors really shine, as most OLED screens will offer response times of 1 millisecond or lower, as we can see here with the 342C. IPS panels are generally next in line, while VA is typically slower, though not always, as we can see from the 5 millisecond result for the 275CQ-RXF. A monitor's overdrive setting can also be used to increase the response times. This is accessible in the OSD menu system, and you usually get a choice of a few options. As we can see here, with overdrive turned off we get a slower response time, but turning it up to the fastest mode does result in improvement. Just be careful not to select a mode that increases overdrive by too much, as that can result in overshoot or inverse ghosting, which results in a bright trailing effect on the image. Another key factor for any gaming monitor worth its salt is input latency. This is the time it takes you from moving the mouse or firing a weapon for that action to then show up on screen, measured in milliseconds. Thankfully, most gaming monitors nowadays have low enough input latency that you really won't notice the difference, but typically higher refresh rate monitors like the 240Hz 275CQ-RXF do have slightly lower input latency. Depending on the frame rate being produced by your PC as well, you likely won't be able to maximize the refresh rate of your monitor 100% of the time. This can produce tearing when the frame rate drops below the monitor's refresh rate, but thankfully almost all modern monitors do support adaptive sync. Adaptive sync means the refresh rate of the monitor will change or adapt to match the number of frames being outputted by the GPU. So if you're getting 100 FPS with adaptive sync enabled, the monitor will adjust its refresh rate to 100 Hz. G-Sync is what Nvidia calls their technology, while AMD calls it FreeSync. There are different tiers of FreeSync as well, which can make things a little bit confusing, as this depends on the refresh rate and whether or not the screen supports HDR, but as long as you see the words FreeSync supported, you will be able to get a tear-free experience up to the monitor's maximum refresh rate. We do have a few other more fundamental areas to get to as well. These aren't gaming specific features, but do play a big part in our reviews, as they will impact your overall experience of using a particular screen. The first of these then is going to be brightness, which is pretty self-explanatory. How bright is the monitor going to get? This is measured in nits, and about 350 is considered standard, but as you can see here, the 275CQ-RXF is able to far exceed that, hitting almost 500 nits at 100% brightness, while the 274 UPF even goes beyond that figure. Of course, brightness will vary from screen to screen, but it is worth pointing out that OLEDs typically don't get quite as bright as LCD displays, as seen by the 342C, which hits 228 nits. That could still be usable depending on your environment, but it's not close to what you'd get from an LCD panel. Where OLEDs really shine, however, is with the contrast ratio, which measures the difference between the brightest white and the darkest shade a monitor is able to produce. For example, a 1000:1 contrast ratio means the brightest shade will be 1000 times brighter than the screen's darkest shade. OLED screens are fantastic in this regard, and you'll often hear talk of infinite or effectively infinite contrast ratios, and that's because OLED pixels actually turn off to display a black image. IPS panels will typically be in the 1000 to 1200:1 range, as we can see from the 274 UPF, though VA panels do very well here too, with the 275CQ-RXF hitting 4010:1. Simply put, a higher contrast ratio is a good thing, as you'll get a punchier image with deeper black levels. That neatly brings us on to HDR then, or high dynamic range. Now, in theory, an HDR monitor can display a brighter and higher contrast image with more color detail than a typical SDR or standard dynamic range monitor. The reality though is slightly more complex, as there are so many different tiers of HDR which all promise different brightness levels and different levels of local dimming. OLEDs though are undoubtedly the best here thanks to their per pixel dimming, but for an LCD monitor to do HDR in a real way usually requires mini LED lighting, which can get very expensive. A monitor's color gamut may also be of interest to some people, though arguably this is less important for a gaming monitor. Gamut simply refers to how much of a particular color space the monitor is able to reproduce, the higher the better. Most screens these days will easily hit 100% sRGB coverage for instance, but more advanced color spaces like DCI-P3 will vary. My general advice is that unless you know you need a particular gamut coverage of a particular color space, I wouldn't worry too much about this for gaming. The same also goes for color accuracy. This is measured by something called the delta E, where we see how closely a monitor can reproduce a known color. This result is given in a number, where 0 would be perfect, but a delta E of under 3 is generally considered to be imperceptible to the human eye. The good news is that all 3 MSI monitors tested delivered an average delta E of under 1. Again, color accuracy may be important for some professional workloads, but for gaming, I don't think you necessarily need scientifically accurate colors. The main thing is that they look good. We also have a few other factors that you may want to consider as part of your final buying decision, though depending on your priorities, these may not be quite so fundamental to the overall experience. The first thing to talk about here though is definitely going to be the video inputs, and particularly how many do you get. Obviously, how many inputs you need will vary from person to person, but generally most monitors these days will offer at least one HDMI and one DisplayPort, if not more. HDMI 2.1 though is definitely something to look out for, especially if you game on a console, as the extra bandwidth afforded over HDMI 2.0 means you can output 4K at 120 FPS without degrading color performance. If you only use a single PC though, just one DisplayPort 1.4 is still good enough for almost everything. DisplayPort 2.1 however is starting to become a thing, but chances are you don't need to worry about that just yet. Another factor I like to think about is the OSD and how it's controlled. Thankfully, with all 3 MSI monitors we have here today, a small joystick is placed on the back of the screen, which I much prefer compared to using small buttons to get around, while there are also plenty of options to tweak within the OSD itself. Finally then, you may or may not want to consider an extra value add like RGB lighting, which both the 342C and 275CQRXF support thanks to MSI's Mystic Light. So that brings us to the end of our monitor buying guide. I know there's been a lot of information thrown at you in this video, so if you want clarifications or you have any questions on anything we talked about in this video, please do let me know down in the comments below. It's also worth pointing out that 2 of the 3 monitors we featured in this video are currently on sale thanks to MSI's Black Friday promotions, with the 342C on sale at £999, which is reduced from £1,299, while the 274 UPF is retailing for £449, which is £100 off RRP. For anyone interested in the 275 CQRXF as well, we were told you should keep your eyes peeled around the Christmas period for any deals on that monitor. If you are interested in any of those 3 monitors, we will leave links down in the description below. But that is going to do it for this one, guys. So if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up. And as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already and ding that notification bell so you won't miss out when we upload a new video. We'd also love to carry on the conversation in our Discord server, which is linked in the description below. That is it for this one though, guys. I'm Dominic for KitGuru, and I'll see you in the next video.